session. Let the roll call show who's here. We'll jump right into number 3, initial budget work session.
Your Honor and Counsel, this is the initial budget work session, the kickoff, I guess, for the 2022 budget. Hard to believe we're almost working on 2022 already. But as part of that process, provide a little bit of update on some of the factors that play into next year's budget, as well as some of the factual information we have, some of the economic indicators provide to you to kind of see how we ended up last year, kind of where we're at year to date on some of the various factors. And then probably the most important part is just to get council feedback on what you want to see incorporated into next year's operating budget. So your suggestions, priorities, and goals for next year's budget. Can you read that, or should I try to mark it a little bit more?
Read what?
It's kind of high right now too. Bifocal contacts are an interesting process.
They are.
They're nice for close up, but I'm not sure how they are far away. But I'll try to read through this, I guess. If you have any questions, certainly feel free to stop me along the way. But some of the legislative impacts, certainly, we're still kind of working through with late adjournment in the special session, running up to the June 30th deadline. Not all the information necessarily has been put together by the League of Minnesota Cities yet as far as that impact to cities for next year's budget. What we do know right now, though, is levy limits have not been put in place for 2022. Continue not to receive any local government aid, so that's not an impact for us budget-wise, as well as there was no changes to the market value homestead exclusion program that replaced the former market value homestead credit in 2012. So like I said, we'll continue to kind of monitor that and see how that plays out a little bit as we move forward. One of the things that was delayed a little bit, Representative Warrencourt Dilworth did have a proposal in his tax bill to kind of look at more of a taxpayer day where the city, county, and school district all would be required to have what was the former truth taxation meeting on the same day. That didn't make it into the final legislation, but there were a number of other things that were being considered. One of them is some additional information that would have to go out with the public notice that goes out by the county for that meeting. That was fortunately delayed until next year, so we'll have to kind of look at, because of the short timing of that, we can continue to work on that to see what that impact is of another unfunded mandate that cities will have to potentially comply with. So some of the other items that would be factored into next year's budget, I do have a little bit of information on some of the property valuations and new construction, looking at the spring abstract from 2021, comparing it to last year. Look at that in a moment here to kind of see how that's changed from one year to the next. The next part of that, I will go back and update the fall final abstract to see what the actual change was from the end of the year after they made the adjustments. But the spring to spring one provides at least a comparison of where we're at from one year to the next. For personnel costs, health insurance costs typically are known later in August when we receive the renewal. We typically budget for a 12% increase conservatively. Sourcewell has provided a 12% cap that's in place, so we know that that will be kind of the maximum number if we choose not to make any other changes, or if for some reason our utilization is higher than projected. We're still looking at about a 12% at the maximum increase in that cost. But we'll update that cost as we know it late in August. There weren't any changes to the para, police and fire, or the coordinated plan for retirement rates for 2022, so that remains at the 17.5% and the 17.5% respectively. We have currently labor contracts are in place for another year, so there are no changes for that for 2022. As far as workers' compensation premium increases for the insurance, the league is recommending about a 10 to 15% increase in those rates, just due to COVID-19 and some of the PTSD claim costs that are being incurred at this point. Good news front, the fire contract with the city of Brainerd is scheduled to decrease by about 0.68%. That's just kind of based on our contribution went up a little bit last year, but looking at the fact that some of those demographic changes for us were outpaced by some of the other jurisdictions within the fire pool area. Let me kind of look at some of the outside requests that we received. The Central Minnesota Initiative Foundation didn't request an increase, so they're requesting the same $53.30 for 2022. Great Lakes Area Economic Development Corporation is requesting a $1,000 increase to $36,000 to their funding contract for 2022. Some of the other costs that we know kind of would be factored into the budget include the property, liability, and auto insurance coverage to the Minnesota cities. There too, they're recommending about a 10% increase in property coverage and about a 3% to 7% increase in liability and auto, just based on some of those reinsurance costs that are kind of running through the market right now. Property costs have been down a little bit because there haven't been any bad storms, but that reinsurance cost is what's kind of driving the potential 3 to 7% increase, 10% increase respectively on those rates. One of the other things they're kind of looking at a little bit too is just kind of reclassifying how some of the properties are reclassified. That initial data suggests that some utility property classifications will increase quite a bit compared to some of the other properties, so that will just depend on each city's mix of properties that they're insuring. We certainly have a water treatment plant as well as water towers and things along that side, but as far as a wastewater treatment plant, we don't directly have, but we get contract with the city of Brainerd, so if they're seeing some increase there too, we probably would see a little bit increase in the treatment costs for next year, depending on what their budget comes in as well. And then just kind of the unknown as far as COVID-19 and any of the other ongoing costs and revenue reductions. We haven't typically seen any significant revenue reductions, as you saw in some of those graphs that are provided in the documentation. And I'll talk about it in a few minutes here, but as the pandemic continues, be cautious and continue to monitor that as well. For next year, we do have both primary and general elections that we'll need to budget for 2022. One of the other notices that we did receive recently was Crowley Power has elected to discontinue its municipal meter relief program. Basically what was happening is the 52 meters that we have in the city, they weren't charging for that, and according to Crowley Power, that amounts to close to a little bit under $15,000 a year, so that's something that we'll have to incorporate into our budgets going forward. We'll have to take a little bit closer look on the breakdown of that on where that's occurring, I guess, with those 52 meters. But that's an additional cost that we'll have to budget for, and potentially just other revenue sources to accommodate that increase.
Is that part of the street lighting program too?
Yeah. So the first table and graph that I kind of included in the packet was just a comparison of our tax capacity as well as the tax increment that we received in the city for the last 10 years. You can see here for 2021, about 60% of our tax increment tax capacity that's generated is being used for city infrastructure. So that's the bonds that we sold for Idle Drive project, TIF districts 10 and 12, as well as TIF district 14, which was the Excelsior and Edgewood project. So we're using the tax increments generated from those TIF districts to pay for repay the bond payments for that utility and street improvements that we did on those projects in 2010 and 2018. That's followed by about 30-some% that's being used for some of the housing projects that we have pay-as-you-go notes with the developer to reimburse them for the cost of providing affordable housing within the city, and then a little under 10%, 9.4% that's being used currently for the Bantech commercial industrial redevelopment project. So you can kind of see their overall percentage of tax increment that's of the overall tax base is about 4.7%. So that's hovered between anywhere from as low as 2% back in 2012 to to as high as 5% in 2019 of the overall tax capacity that's represented by the blue area on the graph here. So overall, you can kind of see in the last 10 years, we saw a little bit of a dip in our tax capacity. That's kind of the residual effect of the Great Recession in 2008, kind of bottomed out about 2014. We're kind of seeing an overall slight increase in tax capacity through 2021, and about the same portion of that is made up of tax income. So next, just looking at some of the economic indicators, I guess, kind of looking at this a little bit we did last year, certainly too, as part of COVID and how that was impacting us. First one is just looking at our lodging tax receipts for 2021 to date compared to the prior year. We're actually up about 20% comparison to 2019 overall, still down about 25%. But I think what's interesting here is when you look at the graph, you can kind of see we've kind of hit that crossover line where 2020 took that huge reduction when with the onset of COVID. Whereas 2021, well, we're still below that about the time that we were starting to emerge from some of the COVID restrictions. We surpassed that red line where it crosses here and have remained higher to the point where kind of increasing to where we were in 2019 as of May at least. And this is the 3% lodging tax that we collect on behalf of the Visitors Association for marketing of the area. The next economic indicator, looking at motor vehicle excise tax receipts, this was part of the the sales tax legislation, where we're authorized to collect up to a $20 motor vehicle excise tax for 0.5%, getting maxed out at that $20 or $4,000 of vehicle value. It's administered directly by the city as part of that process. That's really kind of not really seen that much of a change. In fact, if you look at in comparison to 2019, we're up about 14% for the year to date in 2020. We ended the year 15% higher than we did in 2019. So not really an impact with regard to COVID, at least when it came to the motor vehicle excise tax collections. A little bit of a falling off, I think, now that we've seen since March. It's kind of reduced a little bit down there, but that's kind of running parallel to what it did in 2019 too. Sales were kind of higher in March and then leveled off a little bit through May. And then looking at our actual local option sales tax, the 0.5% local option sales tax that we utilize for water, sewer, stormwater, traffic safety, as well as the revenue sharing agreement we have with for the Brainerd Airport project. 2019 in comparison to 2020, we actually saw about 26.5% increase in the sales tax receipts that were collected. Year to date, 2021, we're running about 20% higher than what we did in 2020. There too, I actually saw a little bit of a dip in June. Typically, the summer months are our higher months before a huge spike in July last year with COVID. But as I mentioned, for 21 year to date, we're running higher than we did over the previous years. I did add, as I mentioned, the following information, I guess, just for some preliminary discussion, review. Comparing the spring abstracts that we received from Crow Wing County for the estimated market value and the new improvements that were added in both of those years. You can see on the following table here, our estimated market value for payable 2022 taxes, which was what it was set at as of the spring of 2021 here on the mini abstract, and this would be before any adjustments that the county makes. So certainly any tax court filings that are settled or appeals or processes as part of that open market book review, that'll show up on the follow evaluation and the final evaluation later on. But we're over $1 billion in valuation. We were close to this before the 2008 recession, before seeing some significant reductions, but we've crossed over that mark once again in the last few years. So up a little bit from the 2021 amount to $1,057,000, or $1 billion, excuse me, 57 million. As far as the new improvements that had occurred, for this year, we have about 11.8 million in comparison to the 9.9 million that we had last year. So the overall change, when you compare those two time periods, both looking at spring abstracts, residential, homesteaded, commercial backing out the new improvements was up about 4.6% in comparison to the apartments being about 4%. Keeping in mind that most of that apartment increase that we saw is within TIF District 14. That's the Excelsior, Edgewood TIF District, where the apartments were built along Clearwater and Forest Drive that are funding part of that project. So that would be available for operating revenue that's being utilized by the tax increment district. Commercial industrial is up about a little over 2.6%, whereas we've seen actually a reduction in the other. The $3.5 million reduction in other is split. About $2 million of that was attributable to non-commercial residential or seasonal recreational residential, and 1.5 million of that was related to ag and rural reductions. So maybe some classification changes there, as well as valuation reductions that the county put in place last year. So then just looking at the kind of a pie chart just showing that comparison one year to the next, you can kind of see last year we had about 57% of our estimated market value was made up of that residential component, where it's about 58% preliminarily for 2022's payable. In comparison, commercial industrial made about 33%, and now it's about 31%. Apartments, I think, were relatively unchanged. It went up a little bit from 8 to 9%, and then that other category is at 2% in both of those years. The next section I'm not going to necessarily go through in great depth, but I did include it in your packet just for some background. These are the funds that we do budget for. We certainly have our general fund, which is made up with the general operating fund of the city, so it accounts for most of the operations of the city, where there isn't a special revenue fund, where it's a special revenue that's funding the majority of the project. We do have certain special revenue funds, including our cemetery, community development, which is planning and zoning, building inspections, our capital park fund, for park dedication fees. Our EDA is part of our economic development fund. As I mentioned, we have our lodging tax administration fund that we account for the lodging tax receipts that are collected. And then we have an aggregate of our tax increment funds for 11 currently active TIF districts within the city. And then finally, the sales tax collections fund, where we account for the sales and motor vehicle excise tax that we collected. On the capital fund side of things, we have our capital equipment fund, our collector street fund, our street replacement fund, as well as our trail construction and maintenance funds. And then finally, we have a debt service fund that make up of our governmental funds. In addition to that, we have 3 enterprise funds in the city, one being the water fund, the second being the sewer fund, and then the third one is the stormwater fund. With that, I guess I'll turn it back over to the council. I guess just as I mentioned, the next more important portion of tonight's discussion is kind of looking at council priorities, goals that you would like to see incorporated into next year's budget as we put together our budgets.
So you are going to be in the next few days accumulating budgets from the department heads on the standard things that they need or want, putting those together. Pardon me?
Correct, yes. Budget packets have been distributed to the departments, so they're kind of working on those currently. They're due back next week, and then we'll take the next month to kind of assemble all those costs. And then we have a bigger meeting on August 30th scheduled to kind of go through a preliminary discussion on that as we start to whittle that down.
So are you wanting us to throw things at you tonight?
I think we would appreciate knowing those things, so as the departments work on their budgets, they can incorporate those things, or at least placeholders for those, yes.
Okay.
Yep. Not to say other things don't come up along the way, but at
Sure.
least giving us a heads up or we can kind of start working on those things.
Mr. Mayor,
Yep.
I don't have a list of wants, I just have kind of one want. And that would be that we incorporate maximum increase in our budget to services that we provide and try to hold the line as to what taxes we're asking people to pay.
Okay. Anybody else, anything that you've been thinking about or heard about, or would you like to?
This, I'm sure, will come as a huge surprise to everyone, but since the purchase agreement, from what I understand, has gone through with Camp Vanessa, is that right? I thought I read that. the
Verbally,
purchase
maybe
agreement-
we're working on the purchase agreement, which will be before council August 4th. And the way that the purchase agreement is structured, we would have any time from August 4th through July 15th next year to take ownership of it. But yes, it's the flexibility that council wanted,
Okay,
to make sure that we didn't have to start putting money down on it from day one. We left that flexibility.
got it. So assuming that we could make that happen, maybe late spring, I would really like to pursue the creation of a dog park and also the possibility of seeking donations towards that, if that would help facilitate the project. I would be happy to chair that, whatever the correct title would be.
Hey, go ahead, anybody else? I chatted with the chief a little bit, I don't know, today or whatever, there's a lot of, at least I get, and I got a feeling the rest of you too, complaints, concerns about the traffic speed, in our residential areas. And I know that, in some of the new projects now, we've put the permanent, speed limit signs with lights and so on and so forth. But that doesn't necessarily help in everybody's neighborhoods. And yeah, I'm just kind of wondering, every once in a while, somebody will see the speed trailer and then they will say, well, why can't I have that in my neighborhood? Yeah, on more of a rotational basis. And we have one now that we share with Brainerd, is that correct? We own it.
Yep.
We own it together with Brainerd. And I'm just wondering if that's not enough, if we should, we've got more plats in the residential areas, you know, than obviously we did a few years back. And I'm just wondering, I'm not sure what the costs are, but I'm wondering if we should, you know, maybe budget for another one of those and rotate both of them a little bit. I don't know what our rights are on the one that we have halftime. I don't know what that equates to as far as days and hours are concerned, but we may, just an opinion, we may be ready for a second one. You know, I don't know, and just rotate them around neighborhoods and just remind people that it's not a cure-all. I understand that, but people have requested them before. You know, why can't you rotate that into my neighborhood? So this is something to think about, to see what the costs are, and we can make a determination afterwards on that. But that's something that has come up recently, and people have been talking about it. Just for now.
I guess the only thing I would add is just, I don't have any specific priorities or goals other than to say, as departments are crafting budgets, I'd love to see any kind of focus on an investment on things that might make the work more efficient over time, or things that would make interacting with citizens and businesses more smooth and efficient, simpler, just those kind of things, which I would leave to the departments to figure out what that might be for them, but just if they have a moment to add those kinds of thoughts to what they're looking at investing in, I'd be a supporter of that.
know that individually we can think of a lot of things. I'm always kind of curious to hear what the staff knows better about what they need versus, you know, my wants. And so it's easier to have the conversation once we see that. The problem is it's further down the road. So we got the chicken and egg thing going on here too. So trying to be upfront with, in fairness to staff, you guys have an idea what we're thinking about. So not blindsided on the further on into August.
I still have a concern too, I guess, about workload amongst the staff. I'm not concerned about more than a couple of people just totally frying themselves.
Just pull your mic up a little bit there, towards you anyway.
I'm just concerned about workload with departments, and I don't want people to destroy their mental health and physical health by overworking, so I'd like to see how you're feeling about that, if additional personnel are needed.
I know how this works. You guys are gonna go back to the drawing board, and we're gonna rip it apart when we see it. You're gonna say, why did you say that?
It's a process.
It's brain freezes right now, but they'll thaw out.
No, I think that's good help. I mean, certainly we're not set in stone. I think, as we get into August and stuff, you'll see kind of what the departments are thinking, what the recommendation is, at least at that point. You can choose to kind of let next month whittle away at that part of it, or if there's other things you want to include in there, or placeholders you at least want to keep. Keep in mind that as of the end of September, we have to adopt a preliminary levy, which can be increased from that point, so it can certainly go down, but it helps as much as we can focus in on the process. That helps, but if there's still some things that aren't known, that we need some more time over the next few months after that to determine, so we can do that too before the final levy's adopted in December.
It's always a concern, though, that we end up in a crisis mode, and that we hurry up towards the end there. And so whatever we can do to avoid that, without, staff still got to have time, I realize that, so. Anything else?
Saying in the meantime, if there's.
I'm sorry?
As I said, was just saying that in the meantime, if something does come up in the next few weeks that popped in your head as you indicated, don't hesitate to inform Jeremy or myself. We'll notify the appropriate staff and try and put some numbers together for that initial discussion in August.
Keep the emails flying, Okay, thanks, Jeremy.
Thank you.
Okay, who's next here? Water treatment plant needs.
Kevin, you're up.
Is the presentation down here?
I don't know, is the presentation loaded?
What's that?
Not
We can plug it in.
flash drive.
I just saved it to a flash drive.
We have it, unless it's something different.
If you have it in front of you, you don't need it on the screen, I can just run off my screen here too.
If it's what you're looking for, I don't know.
Yeah, just
plug in.
call for
Yeah.
You can plug in right there too.
Project status report and discussion.
We should put it on these two. Yeah, I've got one of those display ports. Backwards.
I can see it. You can't hear it, but I can see it.
Very slowly.
White cane out in front of the truck.
I can see.
Yeah, okay.
I can't
That's
like 2020.
So Todd was too, he just thought, I
you all for having me. You've seen various versions of the water treatment plant needs assessment over the last few months, and so my presentation today is not really to dive into every single need or improvement listed in the report, but more to give a general overview of the process and then summarize the estimated costs moving forward that should be budgeted for with the water plant, and then to kind of summarize a few next steps. Some of it's a little bit of a continuation from the meeting last week as well. So, quick background on the water plant. We'll go over how we categorize improvement prioritization categories, the amount of recommended improvements, estimated cost for those, and the next steps. So you're all aware, but just quickly, the water plant was placed online in 2007. Since then, really the operation's been plagued by short filter runs, excessive backwashes being required, really in large part due to just year-round water quality, and then underdrain cap failures, which allowed media to get into your underdrain, and then eventually back in January, filter number 2 underdrain blocks completely failed, which is the reason why we have now awarded bids for the filter reconstruct project. And then starting back in March, SCH, we began working with the city on the filter reconstructive needs assessment project. And so the needs assessment was brought into the project just with some staff concern, or maybe just general concern with this throughout the city that the condition and useful life of some of the plant equipment's maybe been exhausted a little bit early due to the stress that's been placed on it from operational issues associated with excessive backwashing, things like that. And so we had staff process, mechanical, electrical, SCADA instrumentation folks here to go through the entire plant, room by room, process by process, device by device, basically, and look at all components of the plant and come up with things that needed to be improved now, and then provide recommendations for items that would need to be improved in the future, or things like well rehabilitation that typically could be a scheduled and budgeted for item in the future, so that the city can have more of a clear budget moving out to 20 years from now. And so when we looked at needs, we categorized them based on 6 priority levels, one being an immediate need. And so of course the filters were number 1. Priority level 2 were things that we're recommending to be addressed within the next 3 to 5 years. Level 3 was needs for 6 to 10 years. 4, pretty long range, looking at 10 to 20 years. And then priority level 5 is something that we noticed, don't really need to do anything about it now, but staff, while they're doing maintenance in different tanks or whatever in the plant, should monitor certain areas to make sure they're not getting worse. So maybe that in the future those priority levels move, but for now they just need to be watched. And then 6 was basically just recommendations for annual maintenance, service, or inspections that should be implemented on specific types of equipment. And so in all, there's 82 recommendations or improvements that are identified. And that's not to say that there's 82 things that we picked out in the water plant that need to be fixed right now. Those include the things that should be monitored, or the maintenance programs that could be considered. And then things like I said, well rehabilitations, where maybe like every few years you're rehabilitating a well and it's budgeted for, and that shows up multiple times in the list since we were looking out So then a well driller would come and pull the well column pipe, which actually conveys the water out of the well up to the water plant. They pull out the whole piping, the pump and the motor at the bottom of the well, inspect it, determine whether the pipe is good enough to go back in the well, or if it is corroded and pitting and needs to be replaced, or if the pump is worn and needs to be replaced, if the motor needs to be replaced, things like that. And then if you're noticing, or staff is noticing that maybe the flow is dropping in a well, they normally see 700 gallons a minute, or they're only getting 500 gallons a minute, for instance, out of that well, they know that maybe that needs to be rehabilitated. So that's, you can do a scheduled maintenance program to try to prevent, that failure, yeah.
We have two that are scheduled for this year, 2 well rehabilitations where the pump's gotta be completely pulled and they're gonna acid wash the screen. See, he's asking a little more specific, I think. We gotta acid wash these screens and get the specific capacity back, because that's exactly what we got. We got 2 wells right now that are down below 600 gallons per minute when they're supposed to be at 700.
So we took these 4, really 1 through 4 priority levels and grouped them into 4 project timelines. So most of the priority 1 items are brought into the filter rehabilitation project. There are others that are listed as short-term improvements that their city already had quotes for some of these improvements, and so made more sense to just have that done with the quote that has already been obtained. Or, with the filter rehab project, there wasn't a need to dig into the wells necessarily and pull pumps for the wells. The city has a contractor that they like working with for well rehabilitations or well work, and so some of those needs were left out of the main capital improvement project here. There's a skate upgrades project planned for later this year. And then water treatment plant capacity evaluation improvements, that's related to the biological versus clarification. Improvements just to try to extend filter run times, so you're reducing backwashing and wear on equipment in the water plant as much as anything. And then longer term improvements that eventually would be brought into a project much further out into the future. And so just looking at the estimated cost for these different priority levels, a difference from previous reports here is that priority 1, the as-bid cost for the filter project has been brought into this, and so that actually brought the estimated priority 1 cost down from what it was. And so we're showing a immediate need at the water plant for a total cost of about $2.5 million. If we look at priority level 2 with a 2 to 5 year improvement range, we're about $860,000 up to $6 million. That wide range is associated with can you convert to biological filtration using the equipment that the water plant already has, which we talked about last Thursday, or do you need to look at building in addition onto the water plant, adding a file, which would be a much more expensive project. And so we discussed last week adding things like VFDs to the wells, adding DO sensors to the filters, and optimizing the plant's existing aerators to try to make that first step into at least be prepared to switch to biological as part of this improvements project. And so I think the direction that we seem to be moving is closer to the lower end of that cost range than the higher end, at least as a first step. Prior to level 3, 6 to 10 years is about $800,000 need at the plant. Look out 10 to 20 years. Prior to level 4, about $2.1 million in need. In that priority level 4, there are cost associated with drilling a new well 5 in that 10 to 20-year range, as well as a budgeted filter reconstructing or filter rehabilitation, kind of as a worst-case scenario if there's no improvements to the operation of the plant, get this cost, I guess, in the city's budget, so it's not an emergency, or it's not planned for the future, and you have to come up with $1.2 million in 12 years that you don't have planned for. The monitor or as desired needs, category 5, there's a little under $200,000. And so when, I guess that summarizes all the different needs that we identified at the plant. Kind of the next step is looking forward at how do you optimize the water treatment plant and kind of planning for the long term to do that. And so this table summarizes kind of 4 alternatives. Alternative 2 is split into 2A and 2B. Basically looking at 3 different ways to move forward at the water plant. Alternative 1 would be do nothing, basically rehab the filters every 10 years. That 10-year timeline is based on the fact that you start having issues with the filters at about year 12. So in order to, like I said, prevent kind of an emergency project where the filters would be out of commission, scheduling that rehab early. So that's the do nothing option, basically over the 60-year planning period, which I'll explain here in a little bit. Come up with a total just capital cost of all those filter rehabs being about $8.4 million. Alternate 2A would be converting the water plant to biological filtration, using the equipment that you have at the plant, and then kind of assuming worst case, if biological filtration doesn't work like past pilots that we showed, and you still need filter rehabs every 10 years. But accounting for this $65,000 per year chemical cost savings or operational cost savings that the pilot study identified. That takes this 60-year capital cost basically $4.7 million. Alternate 2B is again converting to biological filtration, but more of a best case scenario. You get longer filter run times, you don't have to backwash as much, you don't need filter rehabs as often. That extends the filter rehab schedule up to 20 years, still taking up that $65,000 a year operational savings. That drops that cost to $1.1 million. And then alternate 3 is adding a clarifier to the existing process so that you can get longer filter run times, reduce the number of backwashes, and extend the filter life. And that comes out to $8.5 million about. And so, with the operational savings at the plant by switching to biological filtration are obviously really attractive. And so, kind of continuing with last Thursday's conversation, it seems like that's a pretty good first step to try to optimize the plant performance and try to squeeze a little bit more capacity out of the plant and get by for a little longer before you need to look at either building more filters on the plant or adding something like a clarifier. And so the long-term recommendations coming out of that are to further explore biological filtration and or clarification. If you're looking at alternate 2, try to optimize the city's existing equipment to make that biological filtration conversion because it is really the least costly, or at least capital, at least from a capital cost perspective, it's the least costly alternative. Plus, hopefully you actually do realize those operational savings annually. And then alternate 3, before you jump forward and go with it, constructing a clarifier at the plant, do a pilot study to make sure that, at least on a pilot scale, you actually could see longer filter run times, fewer backwashes, and the intent of that system could actually be met. That's kind of the needs assessment and, high-level overview. Be happy to answer any questions.
Kevin, what's the annual cost over the next 20 years that the city needs to budget for it?
Ooh, the
Depends
total.
which one you go with.
Yeah, yeah.
You didn't have it.
I don't
I
have
don't
the.
have a slide on that, but it's in the report. That's what I was getting at. I wish we would have that slide.
For each of the four that's in there.
Yeah, yeah, there's an annual cost. Right now, for next year, we're gonna put in the annual cost, hoping that biological would take and increase the filter run times. That's what we're gonna propose for next year's budget, but if that does not work, see that changes the budget in 2023. I just wanted to see that.
And we should realize within a year if we're gonna see lower,
We're gonna know it tomorrow.
longer run times between.
Yep.
So, one question I had was, when you flipped that slide with the years on there,
Yep,
you want to do a pilot study on clarification to see if we're gonna see the longer run times, but you assumed 20, you've already assumed a longer run time
yep,
to make that cost.
yep.
So, can you, I know you can't guarantee longer run times with clarification.
I'd be very confident in telling you that you get longer filter run times if you had a clarifier, because it would reduce the iron loading onto the filters.
To the same degree that we saw with the biological pilot program.
So I think you'd probably see similar, filter run times, but you'd still have the chemical cost. Cause you'd still be using chemicals more than likely to make,
With
an
the
iron manganese particle to settle out in the clarifier, where with the biological, you're just trying to use the oxygen in the water and let the bugs basically eat the iron and the manganese and the ammonia. And there's a scenario where you could try to combine biological filtration with that, but.
Sure. I kind of like the 2B option, not the 2A option.
Yeah, that'd be a really nice option. I guess I never did say why we picked a 60-year planning cycle. We would go under the assumption that clarifier would last 60 years. And so over the life of that clarifier, what do all these options look like?
So at the end of 60 years, we're basically starting over.
We'd just be starting over.
Yeah. If we get the plant to run 60 years, I think we're doing good, right?
We'd be doing really good.
Oh, we're rehabbing plants that are 60 and 70 years old right now. So concrete lasts a while.
Any other questions or comments? Whatever plan we choose, it's expensive. Not a lot of choices here. Anything else, Trevor, you want to add, or we?
The only thing I would add that probably at the end of next year in 2023, depending on what the results are, then we'll probably want to update this needs study, do an update to it to get more realistic numbers at which roadmap we're going, which direction we're going. So just something to throw in there, probably in 2023, we would be looking at an update to this report. And then hopefully by that time, we kind of know, like I say, exactly where we're headed. So we don't have 4 different options then, in there. And get us a better budgeting number, for the 20-year period.
Yeah, if you do switch to biological filtration in 2022, you have a pretty good idea of where your filter run times are at,
Yeah.
what sort of chemical cost savings you're seeing.
I guess one thing I want to say, and hopefully, I don't know where you're sitting on this, but in one of your look-aheads, it was look at a pilot program for clarification and possibly designing a clarifier
just to run through, we said the pavement management plan update. We'll go through the plan objectives, some history, look at a new option for pavement management, microsurfacing, how to implement microsurfacing, and then some estimated costs. The plan objectives is to preserve and perpetuate the existing city-owned, local-owned, and municipal state-aid streets in a fiscally responsible manner, correct pavement deficiencies and slow the rate of pavement deterioration, consider immediate and long-term needs of the existing local street pavements, coordinate those maintenance and rehab activities with utility repairs and redevelopment, and then provide information for better informed and involved decision-making for the long-range plan. The plan was developed in 2013, updated in 2015. We've been utilizing the PACER rating system for each segment of the city streets, with 10 being a newly paved surface and one basically failed pavement or back to about a gravel street at that time. Preventative maintenance activities were programmed for ratings 6 and higher, and then rehabs for 5 and lower. With the plan from 13 and 15, the maintenance activities being crack filling, patching, and chip sealing or seal coating, rehabilitations with pavement mill and overlays, pavement fold-up reclamations or reconstructions. I've included this table from our annual PACER ratings. It's very somewhat difficult to read, but basically in 2013, the overall city average was basically 6.1. Over 6 years, that rate jumped up to about a 6.9. So we were seeing improvements system-wide, with the greatest, I guess, improvements in the municipal state aid, which that a lot of full-depth reclamations and reconstructions. So some older pavements jumped from 4s to 10s, which would kind of jump that overall average in those up. The local streets have pretty much jumped from a 6.1 up to about 6.5, 6.6, and have been holding, I guess, steady for the last 5-6 years. As part of the plan, the city was divided into 7 management areas. Rehabs were programmed in the areas with the greatest amount of poor pavements, basically with reconstruction and rehabs. Kind of a worst is first program, and then the preventative maintenance activities, which again were crack filling and seal coating, were programmed for 3 years later to seal coat the newly paved streets, again at a relatively early age. So the city did complete seal coating projects in 14, 15, 16, and 17. And I think, as we're all aware, started to see pavement deterioration. The underlying pavements are stripping, particularly Knollwood Drive by Forest View and Cedar Scenic west of Memorywood Drive. Also kind of seeing it throughout some other residential areas. And some of those were milled and overlaid in 2019 as part of the city rehab project. As those were observed, the seal coating was discontinued in 18, 19, and 20, or not completed seal coat projects. In March of this year, Utility Commission recommended and City Council approved moving forward with this plan update and to discontinue the use of seal coating. So since March, city staff and Bolton and Mink have researched available maintenance activities to extend the life cycle of the Baxter streets, and have kind of narrowed in on an activity called microsurfacing in lieu of seal coating. So microsurfacing, it's similar to seal coating in that it's a mixture of asphalt, water, small crushed rock, and some chemical additives, polymers added, basically to get a good mixture of that material. And basically, where a seal coating, it was oil put down, rock over the top of it, and then rolled together. The material is mixed, and here's kind of a picture of the activity. So it's kind of like a mobile batch plant going down the highway, and that the truck has the aggregate, and then the emulsion and such is in that machine following with an augered system that comes out the back in about a 3/8 or ½ inch layer and is spread out over the street. And so with the amount of oil it's kind of bonding to the street, there's kind of a chemical reaction that breaks and hardens in a quick period of time. So on average, the street can be reopened in about an hour.
When you say break, what do you mean by break?
Well, kind of that chemical reaction is happening, that the mixture is starting to harden. It's not like laid out and it needs sun and air to harden. It's more of a chemical process, I guess.
Brian, is that kind of what's happening on County Road 48 with the county?
They are continuing to chip seal, so that is what the city has decided to discontinue. But that was where they laid oil down, dropped the aggregate on top of it, rolled it out. They sweep up the loose aggregate and then come back and spray a layer of oil to basically seal that rock surface together.
And micro-resurfacing between College Drive north on 371 a few years back, what, 4 or 5 years maybe?
And then north of the city up to Nisswa too.
They did from Donlingers to Nisswa, so just a couple of years ago. No, it wasn't like 2 years.
So there's examples of that in our area.
Yeah, the agencies we've talked with, MnDOT District 3 does microsurfacing, every year. District-wide, they bid a project. They found that it was useful in cities to extend pavements where they have heavy traffic, with their state highways in municipal locations, and that they actually they can do this themselves and contract out. And so they use this pretty much district-wide, and I guess recommended, or so they are continuing to use it, I guess, in urban settings as well. Also, we've talked with Little Falls, has done it the last 5 years, and I guess 5 years is starting to build a little bit of a history there, and has said that they haven't had issues, or they've been happy with.
Anybody seen stripping with micro-resurfacing?
I've asked that, and I guess I have not gotten that answer that they have. As we mentioned, D3 administers a yearly wide project, and then, as we talked, a local project that was recently completed, was 371, basically from Pine Beach Road north up to Nisswa. That highway section was milled and overlaid in 2018, and then 8 years later, microsurfaced in 2019. Talking with MnDOT, also some Tom Wood that works at Aztec, as well as was with MnDOT pavement for probably almost 30 years. They talked about a 2-surface application, and so first surface, generally it's the same process, a little bit different with oil and the aggregate, but the first surface comes through, basically puts the crown back in the road if you have slight rutting and cracking, and so that fills in those transverse cracks that, and so fill that in, get the crown back, and then they come back a day later as this hardens relatively quickly, and then put on this surface course, which is basically puts the it's probably like the second, one's primer and one's the second coat of paint to kind of get that nice clear seal. It is, aggregate, so you do have a relatively, high friction, put the friction back in your highway, so it's, it's stopping and that sort. But, so they both recommended the two surface, I guess, solution instead of just going through with one surface. I think this will help more fill in with that rutting and the cracking, which I think would help preserve the pavements over time.
Is that double the cost then, or?
No. We estimated $4 a yard for the one surface application and $5 a yard for the two. We bid the pilot project here in this month, and at least for the first one, the two surface application bid did come in 20% lower. We're basically right back about at that 4%. I mean, it is cheaper, but not by 50%. Obviously, it's less labor and material. So plan implementation, in the plan update for you tonight, we're looking at an 8-year rotation. Age of the pavements is really going to drive kind of which sections are done. So that's been utilized for the timing of the maintenance. And then an 8-year cycle was chosen with research showing that the roads in good condition should be microsurfaced within 7 to 10 years after being rehabbed or reconstructed. So the goal laid out would be to utilize microsurfacing to get a life cycle. It's laid out between mill and overlays in this plan, 20 years for commercial streets and 25 years for residential streets. We're kind of taking out that 7 management area and looking more at pavement age, grouping neighborhoods together to try and, I guess, time these maybe a little bit better. Still being cognizant that we don't want to just coordinate all improvements, in one area of the city. So trying to spread those out, but looking more at pavement age than just rotating around the city every year. Initial planning implementation, 2021, we have the pilot project on Clearwater Road from Kimberly over to Inglewood, and then Inglewood from Woida down to Excelsior. Then 2022 and 23, we have a couple residential neighborhoods that have not been addressed to this point in the pavement management plan. Reviewed those with Mr. Wood, and while they have older than those 10-year pavements, they're still, I guess, holding pretty strong with some PACER ratings of 6 to 8. And so he said he would have no issue with microsurfacing those. The cracking isn't, I guess, gone to a point that he feels this wouldn't be beneficial. And so I think these will give a good, combined with Clearwater and Inglewood, they're a little past that 10-year point, and then these are as well. If this is a viable option, which we think it is, even for some pavements, maybe that year 8 isn't the magic number. We're trying to be maybe a little conservative in the approach, but can this even be spread out maybe a little bit longer in between and get the benefit of stretching those pavement life cycles out between mill and overlays? And I think in the residential areas, that's a big possibility. All the research we've found is generally the research is on highways with a lot more traffic and trucks, and I think with residential, with the chip sealing, we saw some turning movements at driveways and such, and I guess I haven't seen that being an issue with microsurfacing, and that they said that basically the failure they've seen is that it's just over time it was wear off.
So does MnDOT over time do multiple layers of micro resurfacing?
I believe they mill and overlay microsurface and then buy time to a rehab, which is kind of this approach. You can, as I understand, microsurface on top of a microsurface. And so I think this is kind of taking a conservative approach with not showing that. And I guess if I kind of skip to the end, so we have a maintenance or a microsurface, program here, then we have the rehab and reconstruct numbers over here. So if you can microsurface on top of that, basically it would increase,
You'd save 80.
it increase this, but it would decrease this.
Right.
And so, they didn't lay that out right. This, I think, is a more conservative approach to start with, but I believe that definitely could be the case as it's, I guess,
I hope so.
so, yeah.
Because when we first looked at our plan, we were talking about chip sealing and bringing that surface back up every 5 to 7 years, and actually pushing out to 30, 40 years before we had to do anything major. So I think we're being almost ultra conservative with only looking at one application per road. And, why wouldn't micro resurfacing do the same thing that we were doing in our original plan, but with the chip sealing? Add multiple layers to push that out. And just the other thing, my really poor road in my neighborhood, which is just 1.5 inches on sand, maybe gravel, but mostly sand, it's lasted 40 years, other than fixing the potholes. So, if we're gonna spend a bunch of money, we need to see some results from it. And I would hope on our pilot program, we would see some results before we necessarily go into a full-blown program. So I know we're budgeting this out, and we're jumping right in. Do we want to see results from the pilot program before we jump into this with both feet? Because we're throwing all our eggs in this one basket at this point. I don't know, it's just a kind of a rhetorical comment, but
It's a good question.
We did the same thing with the chip sealing, Mark.
I know.
We go back to the very first slide. We did the chip sealing in 2013 and did the conservative approach. And then in 2015, we went in and updated that chip sealing plan and made it more realistic of the results we were seeing. So this goes back to with like the needs report for the water plant. This really needs to be evaluated probably 2 years from now and see what the results are showing. And that's why in the first 2 years, in 2022 and 2023, we picked some of them older roads, like we did with Clearwater, Inglewood for the pilot project this year. We picked some of them older neighborhoods to see if we can push them from 25 years to 30 or 35. But we didn't want to show that. We wanted to show you the worst case scenario first, because it's always easier to extend it out and make it and show better. But if we show better right from the start and then we can't deliver, then we have the same problem again. So that's why it shows the way it shows. Well, I think in 2 years, we need to go back in and reevaluate this, look at it and say, okay, is it really working? And what is it gonna extend the life? Have we brought the PACER ratings up from that 5 and 6 to 7 and 8 when we did the PACER rating? Compared to what it was, like Inglewood Clearwater, PACER rating will be due in 2022. We do that this year. What's the PACER rating show next year when we go through and evaluate it? If it's actually raised it some, now we can start projecting that out. And that's what we did with the chip sealing program in 2013 and 2015. We started down here, then we went, but then in 2016, the stripping started. So it just,
So we have an idea though that, assuming this works as well as chip sealing was supposed to work without stripping, there's an assumption, I think, like what you're saying, is it's pushing it out significantly or meaningfully.
the assumption that other cities are using is that it extends the pavement life 7 to 10 years. If that's the case, then we would go from 25 to 32 to 35 years for residential streets. We're just saying we did not take that approach from day one because we don't know if it will. Just like the chip sealing was supposed to, it did not deliver.
And my last rhetorical question. If chip sealing is failing at Baxter, why did the county just put down all 48-inch chip seal?
The county has a better chance at, one of the biggest problems is how close your surface of your road is to the water table. All county ditch design is designed with 5-foot deep ditches. That's meaning that the water is 5 feet down from the surface. We have a lot of our roads that the surface water is within 3 feet.
Not at 48 and Evergreen.
I know, but I'm just saying, on an average, that is one of the biggest things they found in those studies that was not working. Otherwise, exactly the chip sealing that they're doing on their streets is exactly what we're doing on ours, and they have not seen significant stripping. Why? I don't know.
Alright.
There's no
Get them out of our
scientific,
questions.
there's no scientific information out there that's proven one way or another what's causing stripping, 100%. Every city, every county, every state agency has got different results nationwide.
Anything else for Brian? Got one last item here, so. We're good, thank you.
I'm gonna take the last one.
Oh, you're gonna have one.
Pinch hit tonight.
Well, welcome back.
Yeah, with the Englewood Drive project, back with the intersection here of 210 and Knollwood Drive. Guess I'll just jump right to, over the last couple months, this is the layout that you've seen before from the Trunk Highway 210 study with an RCI. We've been in quite a bit of conversation with MnDOT. They were not agreeing that Knollwood would just be a free and open intersection similar to what Englewood Drive is today. And so we're looking at this RCI design. City stance that we brought to them is that these improvements, any improvement made in the Trunk Highway corridor would need to be a MnDOT cost. And so the discussion is what could that look like with an RCI. The cost with this layout, which basically entailed getting out of the 2 lanes and into this left turn lane immediately, is that it conflicts with the existing left-hand turn lane going from 210 into Knollwood, which caused some quite a bit of median work, and then the widening of 210. And so through discussions with local MnDOT and their geometric design unit in St. Paul, this is an RCI layout that has been used in the past, where as you, when you're making your turn off of Knollwood and heading west, you utilize the existing 2 lanes for the width of the existing turn lanes, about 350 feet, and then come in to that RCI left-hand turn lane and around. And so what this does is it reduces the cost about in half. There's quite a bit less work with the median and widening of 210. And so basically from Knollwood to the end of this RCI layout is about 700 feet to make that turn to head back to the east. And so this is a layout that MnDOT says they can support. We've continued to go forward with, if this is implemented, that it's at their cost. And I guess verbally, it's my understanding, they said they will be heading down that path to fund this layout as it would be implemented in the city's Inglewood Drive project.
So they will pay for what part of what's on the screen? Everything? Or
Everything except the two green areas on the south side of Trunk Highway 210 at the existing Knollwood intersection,
so all that is removing
the existing road.
pavement and grassing?
They'll pay to remove the existing signal lights, they'll pay to change all the concrete median, they'll pay to change everything on the north side of Trunk Highway 210 all the way back to Fairview.
Can't argue with that.
Oh, it's good to have it done at one time instead of going back. You know, if they do it, if they do it now, during their process, then we'd be.
They're gonna write us a letter though, right?
Be ready.
Tell us how to do that.
Oh, yeah.
We can request what we want.
It increases their contribution by around $500,000. Right now, they were gonna contribute 1.2 million to this project, now they're up to about 1.7.
Anecdotally, on 169, they put in quite a few of these. And what amazes me is the number of cars. They might as well have left the straight shot across, because when those cars make that U-turn, they jump right across 2 lanes of traffic into. I'm glad we're not getting the first one, because those cars jump right across those 2 lanes of traffic into that far lane to make their left. So this will be better.
On a side note, we had an open house on this project just recently, I can't remember whenever it was. Last Thursday, whatever it was. And there was comment cards all over the place, people filling them out and everything. Are we gonna see those, or have we had any kind of feedback on that?
I was contacted by one property owner. I met today with Stereo Trevor's answers.
With what?
I met today with Trevor and Trevor, because the property owners were concerned
Oh.
about the size of their lot and costs.
But yes, we are in the process of summarizing those comments and to get answers back. And we're gonna post them on that website, so when everything's posted on the website, everybody will see the answers at once. And we signed all council members up to that website, so anytime a update is done on there, it mass emails that update out to everybody that's registered on that website.
I guess the further with that is that input ID that we've developed for, people can go online and post comments through that web application. There's a map of the project and they can point to specific areas, and that's still open and available to make comments electronically, and then that information will be added
This may
to.
be an ignorant question, but the comments aren't anonymous, are they?
Yeah.
Yeah? Well, that's always good.
No,
I
no.
think you've answered
Like
the
our
question.
comment cards at the informational meeting are all anonymous, they didn't have to sign their name to them or anything. And I don't think it shows even their email address when they make a comment online. No, I don't think so, I think it's all anonymous.
Okay, well, that was some good news tonight.
Yeah, so there's a consensus that we can support the RCI provided that MnDOT. Before we, as we continue to develop, we don't wanna spend more time and resources if that concept isn't supported, so I think that's the direction that
Looking for consensus, and
we're looking for is that there's a consensus for that, so.
So we got that.
Okay.